July 1988, Harlan County, Kansas. The air did not move. It was a physical presence, thick with heat and the fine, pale dust of fields that had not seen a meaningful rain since May. The sun was a white furnace in a bleached sky, and the horizon shimmered, making the distant grain elevators appear to float on a lake of invisible fire. It was the kind of heat that baked the truth out of things, leaving behind only the hard, unadorned facts of the land. Arthur Vance stood at the edge of his section of winter wheat. He was 72 years old, a man made of the same sun-leached material as his fence posts. His skin was a map of his years, creased and browned. His eyes, the color of a faded prairie sky, were narrowed, not against the glare, but in concentration. He did not look at the heads of wheat, which were full and just beginning to turn from a deep green to the color of old straw. He looked lower at the base of the stalks. He knelt, his knees cracking like dry twigs. The movement was slow, deliberate, a conversation with gravity he had been having for decades. He parted the wheat stalks with a hand that was more callous than palm. There, in the shade near the soil, was the reason for his stillness. Chinch bugs, not one or two, but a creeping, dark congregation. They were small, a quarter of an inch long, with black bodies and white wings folded over their backs in a distinctive hourglass shape. They moved with a fluid, unified purpose, a stain spreading through the base of his crop. He ran his thumb over them. They left a reddish smear and a foul, oily odor on his skin, a smell like crushed bedbugs and dry decay. He had smelled it before. He had smelled it in 1954 and again in the dry summer of 1966. It was the scent of a coming plague, a quiet announcement of ruin. He stood up, his joints protesting, and wiped his thumb on his denim trousers. The stain remained. His wheat, a variety called Newton, was still healthy. The heads were heavy, the promise of a good harvest. But the bugs were massing at the southern edge, where his property met the parched pasture that had been overgrazed by his neighbor's cattle. They were coming. He could feel it in the unnatural stillness of the air, in the way the heat pressed down. They were coming for the moisture in his wheat stalks, and they would not stop until the field was a husk. This problem was not new to Harlan County. For years, the response had been chemical. Farmers would see the first signs and call the co-op for a delivery of whatever new insecticide the corporations were selling that season. They would spray the field from tractors, or if they could afford it, hire a crop duster. It worked for a time, but the bugs always came back, and each year the chemicals seemed a little less potent, a little more expensive. The failures were blamed on timing, on the wrong application rate, on the severity of the drought. No one blamed the method itself. It was the only method they knew. The community had come to accept these infestations as a feature of the landscape, a form of unavoidable tax paid during dry years. The talk at the feed store was already turning to it. Men in dusty caps leaned against sacks of feed, speaking in low, resigned tones about the coming invasion. They discussed the price of the latest pesticide, the cost of the fuel to spray it, and the dockage they would take at the elevator for damaged grain. It was a conversation of managed loss, of accepting a smaller defeat to avoid a total one. The idea of preventing the problem, of stopping it before it required a costly chemical war, was not part of the discussion. It was seen as a fool's errand, like trying to negotiate with a tornado. Arthur walked back to his truck, a 1971 Ford F-100 that was more rust than paint, but ran with the reliability of a well-tended clock. He did not drive to the co-op. He did not call an extension agent. He drove home, down a gravel road that bisected his own land. He passed the small, tidy farmhouse where he had been born, the barn his grandfather had raised, and the machine shed that housed equipment from 3 generations. His farm was small by modern standards, just over 600 acres, but it was his. It was all his. He owed nothing to the bank. This financial independence gave him a freedom his neighbors, leverage to their eyeballs for new combines and irrigation pivots, did not possess. It was the freedom to be patient, the freedom to be wrong, if it came to that. A week later, the County Extension Service and a company called AgriCorp Solutions held a town meeting at the high school gymnasium. The air was thick with the smell of floor wax and fear. Nearly every farmer in the county was there, their faces grim, their arms crossed over their chests. On the stage, under the basketball hoop, stood a young man named Kevin Thorne. He was the regional integrated pest management specialist for AgriCorp. Thorne was in his late 20s, clean-shaven, with a confidence that seemed manufactured in a laboratory. He wore a polo shirt with the AgriCorp logo embroidered on the chest and khaki pants with a sharp crease. He stood next to a projector that beamed a colorful slide onto a screen. The slide was titled SiloGuard X, Your Shield in the Field. He spoke with the easy, practiced cadence of a salesman, using words like efficacy, bioavailability, and systemic action. He showed charts with rising trend lines of chinch bug populations correlated with declining rainfall. He showed photographs, magnified 100 times, of a chinch bug's piercing sucking mouthpart. He explained how their new product, SiloGuard X, was a microencapsulated nerve agent that would not only kill the adult bugs, but also sterilize the nymphs, breaking the life cycle. The cost was significant, he admitted, but the cost of inaction, he assured them with a dramatic pause, was far greater. He projected a final slide showing a devastated wheat field next to a lush, green one. The caption read, "The choice is yours." After his presentation, he took questions. The farmers asked about pricing, about volume discounts, about the optimal time to spray. Arthur Vance, who had been standing quietly at the back of the gymnasium, raised a hand. Thorne, seeing the old man in worn-out overalls, gave him a patient, almost condescending smile. "Yes, sir. You have a question. What does it do for the ladybugs?" Arthur asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the suddenly silent room. Thorne blinked. "The ladybugs? Well, SiloGuard X is a broad-spectrum insecticide. There may be some minor impact on non-target species, but our data shows that the primary impact is on the targeted pest. The benefits to your yield far outweigh any minimal collateral effects." "Ladybugs eat chinch bug eggs," Arthur said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Thorne's smile tightened. "That's true. They are a natural predator. But in a full-blown infestation like the one we're facing, biological controls are simply not sufficient. You can't bring a knife to a gunfight, so to speak. We need a comprehensive chemical solution." Arthur nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He asked no more questions. He had heard what he needed to hear. The men around him were already lining up to sign contracts with AgriCorp, their faces a mixture of relief and anxiety. They were buying a shield. Arthur saw them buying a crutch for a problem that had deeper roots. The next day, Kevin Thorne's new white pickup truck, emblazoned with the green AgriCorp logo, was a common sight on the county roads. He drove from farm to farm, walking the edges of fields with his clients, pointing to the encroaching bugs and reassuring them that their investment in SiloGuard X was a wise one. He drove past Arthur Vance's farm and saw the old man out on his tractor, but he wasn't spraying. He seemed to be planting something in a narrow band around the entire perimeter of his wheat field. Thorne slowed his truck, squinting through the dust. It looked like he was planting flowers. He shook his head and drove on, a small, pitying smile on his face. The old man had finally lost it. The talk at the co-op that week was all about Arthur Vance. "Did you see what old Arthur's doing?" Dale, a farmer from the next township, asked a group of men gathered by the coffee machine. "Planting sunflowers. A big old border of 'em right around his wheat." "Sunflowers?" Marcus, who farmed the section north of Arthur, snorted. "What in God's name for? Is he planning on feeding the bugs to death?" There was a round of cynical laughter. The consensus was that Arthur, a man they had all respected for his quiet competence, had finally succumbed to the eccentricities of old age. He was debt-free, they reasoned, so he could afford to play games with his crop. He didn't have a bank loan hanging over his head like they did. They had signed the papers for the SiloGuard X, a decision that added thousands of dollars to their operating costs for the year. Seeing Arthur planting flowers felt like a mockery of their pragmatic, difficult choice. It solidified their own decision, making it seem not just necessary, but wise. They were the serious men, making the hard choices. Arthur was just an old man planting a pretty border around a field that was about to die. Arthur was not bothered by the talk. He had not expected to be understood. He worked with a quiet, methodical rhythm that was impervious to the opinions of others. He was not planting flowers. He was building a wall. He was laying a trap. He was acting on knowledge that did not come from a corporate presentation or university study, but from a source far older and more reliable. That evening, after a long day on the tractor, he sat on his porch as the sun bled across the western sky. The heat of the day radiated from the dry earth, and the cicadas began their nightly drone. He did not turn on the television or the radio. He sat in his father's old rocking chair, the wood worn smooth and dark from years of use, and he remembered. He was a boy of 12, and the year was 1954. The drought was just as bad as this one, perhaps worse. The dust was a constant presence, a fine grit that worked its way into everything: the food, the water, the bedding. The chinch bugs had been terrible that year, a moving black tide that had wiped out entire fields of milo and corn. His father, Samuel Vance, had been a man of few words, much like Arthur himself would become. But when he spoke, the words were heavy with meaning, polished by long periods of silent observation. One afternoon, Samuel had taken him not to the dying cornfield, but to a fallow patch of ground at the far corner of their property, a place where the soil was thin and rocky. It was overgrown with what most farmers considered weeds. Samuel knelt down, just as Arthur had done days ago, and pointed. "Look here, Arthur." The boy looked. He saw a patch of wild sorghum, a tough, grassy plant that grew in clumps. The base of the sorghum was black with chinch bugs. They were swarming it, feeding with a frantic energy. But just a few yards away, the native bluestem grass, a valuable pasture forage, was untouched. "You see," Samuel said, his voice low, "they love this stuff. Can't get enough of it. It's sweeter to him, easier to drink from." He looked at his son, his eyes clear and direct. "The pest is not the problem, Arthur. The pest is the symptom of a problem you created. You planted 1,000 acres of nothing but corn. A feast. You invited them in and gave them no other choice. A smart farmer gives them another choice. That was the core principle. It was a simple, powerful truth that had been lost in the rush for monoculture farming and chemical solutions. Nature did not like a vacuum, and it did not like a buffet with only one item on the menu. The bugs were not an enemy to be annihilated. They were a force of nature to be understood and diverted. The land provides its own defense, his father had told him, standing in the heat of that long-ago summer. You just have to know where to look. Later that year, after the harvest had been salvaged, partly at least, by a late rain, Samuel Vance had sat at the kitchen table with a simple, cloth-bound ledger book. He did not use it for finances. He used it to record the life of the farm. He wrote in it with a fountain pen, his handwriting a neat, deliberate script. He recorded rainfall totals, planting dates, soil temperatures, and his own observations. Arthur, sitting in his rocking chair 34 years later, could picture the page his father had written that night. He went inside, into the small room he used as an office. On a bookshelf, next to manuals for tractors that had long since been sold for scrap, was a collection of those old ledgers. He pulled out the one marked 1950 to 1955. The cloth cover was soft and frayed at the edges. The pages smelled of old paper and ink. He opened it to the entry for August 1954. His father's neat script filled the page. Chinch bugs severe this year due to drought. Lost nearly 30% of the corn. They hit the milo worse. Noticed heavy infestation on wild sorghum near the creek bed. They prefer it. Also on stands of volunteer sunflower. Next time dry weather threatens, plant a barrier. A trap. Sorghum or sunflower. Plant it thick on the south and west edges, where the sun is hottest and they like to start. Plant it 10 days before the wheat heads turn. Give them a better meal. Below the entry was a simple, hand-drawn map of their fields. His father had sketched a thick line around the perimeter of the main wheat field and labeled it. The trap. It was all there. A complete strategy, born not of chemical engineering, but of patient, humble observation. This notebook, and the others that lined the shelf, was the most valuable thing Arthur Vance owned. It was a physical manifestation of generations of knowledge, a record of a long and intimate conversation with this specific piece of land. Armed with this knowledge, Arthur had begun his work. He was not planting randomly. He was following his father's instructions to the letter. He had gone to his machine shed, a cavernous building filled with the ghosts of past harvests. In a corner, under a dusty canvas tarp, was the tool he needed. It was a John Deere Model 55 two-row planter, built in the early 1960s. It was an antique by modern standards, a simple mechanical device with none of the hydraulic or electronic complexity of a new 24-row air seeders his neighbors used. But it was his, and he knew its every bolt and gear. He spent a morning cleaning and lubricating it. He checked the seed plates, making sure they were the correct size for the seeds he intended to use. He filled the grease fittings, his hands moving with the easy familiarity of long practice. He used a hand-cranked grease gun, the same one his father had used. The smell of the grease, the feel of the cold steel, the quiet focus of the work. It was a ritual that connected him to the past. The seeds were also from the past. In a cool, dry corner of the barn, he kept a collection of metal cans filled with seeds he had saved from previous years. He did not buy certified seed from the big corporations. He saved his own, selecting for plants that had thrived on his particular soil, in his particular climate. He found the can he was looking for, its lid held down by a brick. On a faded label, written in his own hand, were the words, Mammoth Gray Striped Sunflower, 1985. These were not the new, oil-rich hybrid varieties that were grown commercially. These were an old-fashioned variety, known for their thick, juicy stalks and large heads. They were exactly what his father's notes had described. They were perfect for a trap crop. He hitched the old planter to his even older tractor, a 1958 John Deere 720 diesel. It was a two-cylinder engine, famous for its distinctive Johnny Popper sound. It was a machine built of cast iron and simple, powerful engineering. Arthur had rebuilt the engine himself a decade earlier. He climbed into the worn steel seat, engaged the flywheel, and the tractor barked to life with a puff of black smoke and a rhythmic, percussive thump-thump-thump that was the heartbeat of his farm. He drove out to the wheat field, the empty planter rattling behind him. He started on the south side, the edge that bordered the overgrazed pasture. He lowered the planter and began his work. The process was slow. The two-row planter meant he had to make many passes to create the 10-foot wide barrier he wanted. He drove at a steady, unhurried pace. He was not merely driving a machine. He was writing a sentence on the land, a long, careful line of defense. He did not plow the ground first. The soil was too dry. Plowing would only release what little moisture it held. Instead, the planter's steel disc cut a narrow furrow into the hard-packed earth. The seeds were dropped in at a precise depth, 1.5 inches, and a press wheel followed behind, closing the furrow and firming the soil around the seed. It was a delicate operation. Too shallow, and the seeds would dry out. Too deep, and they would not have the energy to emerge. Arthur had done this 1,000 times. He did not need a digital monitor to tell him he was doing it right. He could feel it through the soles of his boots, through the vibration of the tractor's steel frame. He worked for 3 days, circling the entire 160-acre field of wheat. He created a perfect 10-foot wide border. From the road, it looked like a strange, obsessive act. His neighbors drove by, slowing their trucks to stare. They saw an old man on an old tractor performing a task that made no logical sense. They saw wasted time, wasted fuel. They saw foolishness. Kevin Thorne drove by again in his air-conditioned AgriCorp truck. He stopped and watched for a full 5 minutes, a look of profound disbelief on his face. He shook his head and took a picture with a small camera, presumably as evidence of the kind of backward thinking his company was fighting against. Arthur saw them watching. He felt their judgment settling over him like the dust from the road, but it did not touch him. He was engaged in a conversation with his father, with the land itself. The opinions of others were like the buzzing of flies, a minor annoyance in the vast, quiet space of his purpose. He was not just planting seeds. He was honoring a legacy. He was trusting a wisdom that had been earned, not purchased. When he was finished, the field looked no different from a distance. But up close, the thin, precise lines of the planter were visible, a frame around the picture of his wheat. He had done what he could. Now he had to wait. He had to wait for the sun and the soil to do their part, and he had to wait for the bugs to arrive. The days that followed were a trial of patience. The heat did not break. The sky remained a hard, unforgiving blue. The chinch bugs, which had been a minor presence, began to multiply. The nymphs, small and red, hatched by the millions. They began to move, driven by instinct and thirst. On the neighboring farms, the chemical war began. The big, self-propelled sprayers, with their 100-foot booms, crawled across the fields, leaving a fine mist of Silo Gardex in their wake. The air took on a faint, metallic smell. Ben Carter, the young farmer who had bought the quarter section to the west of Arthur, was one of Thorne's new clients. Ben was in his late 20s, burdened by a heavy mortgage and the hope of making a good life on the land. He had listened intently at the town meeting and had been one of the first to sign up. He believed in science, in progress. He saw Arthur's sunflowers as a sad joke. He sprayed his field twice, just as Thorne had recommended. He watched the bugs curl up and die by the thousands and felt a surge of relief. He had made the right choice. He had protected his investment. Arthur did nothing. He walked his field every morning and every evening. He watched the chinch bugs massing in the pasture land, their numbers growing daily. He knelt and examined the soil where he had planted his sunflowers. For a week, there was nothing. The ground remained a hard, baked crust. He felt a flicker of doubt, a cold whisper that perhaps this time, the old ways would fail. Perhaps the drought was too severe, the soil too dead. Then, one morning he saw it. A tiny, pale green shoot, no thicker than a piece of thread, pushing its way through a crack in the soil. He looked closer and saw another, and another. They were emerging. The sunflowers were alive. Within 3 days, the entire 10-foot border was covered in a faint green fuzz of emerging seedlings. The sun that was killing everything else was giving them life. Sunflowers, he knew, were plants of the heat. They had deep taproots that could find moisture where other plants could not. They were built for this kind of weather. The chinch bugs began to move. It was not a sudden invasion, but a slow, relentless creep. They moved out of the dry, brown pastures and road ditches, seeking the green, living tissue of the crops. They arrived at Ben Carter's field first. They crawled up his wheat stalks, undeterred by the residue of the Silo Gardex. The chemical had killed the ones that were there when he sprayed, but this was a new wave, a fresh army. They pierced the stalks and began to suck the sap. Within days, the edges of Ben's field began to show patches of yellow, then brown. The plants were wilting, dying from thirst in the midst of a potential harvest. Ben called Thorne in a panic. Thorne came out, his confident demeanor slightly frayed. He took samples, looked at them under a portable microscope. "It's a second wave of nymphs," he said, his voice tight. "The residual toxicity must be lower than we projected because of the intense UV light. We need to spray again. A higher concentration." Ben, seeing his crop dying before his eyes, agreed. The sprayer came out a third time. The expense was becoming ruinous. The black tide of insects reached the southern edge of Arthur Vance's property. They moved across the barren strip of ground between the pasture and his field, and then they encountered the sunflowers. The seedlings were now 4 inches tall, with 2 broad, fleshy seed leaves. To the thirsty chinch bugs, these plants were an oasis. Their stalks were thick, tender, and engorged with sap, far richer and easier to access than the toughening stalks of the maturing wheat. The first wave of bugs stopped. They swarmed the young sunflowers, their black bodies covering the green stems. They did not cross the 10-foot barrier. They had found the easier meal that Samuel Vance had spoken of all those years ago. They had no reason to go further. Arthur stood and watched, his face impassive. He felt no triumph, only a quiet affirmation. The trap was working. Over the next 2 weeks, a silent, dramatic story unfolded along the border of Arthur's farm. The sunflowers grew with astonishing speed in the relentless sun, reaching a foot, then 2 feet in height. And as they grew, They became the host for the entire chinch bug population of the area. They were a living wall, a sacrifice. The outer rows of sunflowers were black with insects. The plants began to wilt and yellow, their life being drained away. But they held the line. They were doing their job. And behind that dying 10-foot barrier, the wheat remained pristine. It was a perfect, untouched island of green, slowly turning to gold. The line between the sunflower border and the wheat was stark, as if drawn by a ruler. On one side was a scene of teeming infestation and decay. On the other side, a healthy, thriving crop. There was no chemical residue, no smell of poison. There were ladybugs everywhere, crawling over the wheat leaves, feasting on the few stray bug eggs that had made it across. The ecosystem was in balance. Ben Carter saw it first. He stood at the fence that separated his property from Arthur's, a post and wire line that now marked the boundary between failure and success. His own field was a disaster. The third spraying had only slowed the bugs, and the damage was widespread. He was looking at a 50% loss, maybe more. He looked across the fence at Arthur's field. It was perfect. It was the best-looking stand of wheat in the entire county. He walked the fence line and saw the reason. He saw the sunflowers crawling with bugs and the clean wheat just beyond. The sight was so simple, so direct, that it defied all the complex logic he had been sold. It was a physical rebuke to his modern, scientific certainty. He stood there for a long time, the dust swirling around his boots, and felt the bitter sting of a lesson learned too late. A few days later, Kevin Thorne's white truck came down the road. He was not driving with his usual speed and confidence. He was driving slowly, as if reluctant to arrive at his destination. He was coming to inspect the fields of his clients, to document the failures of his product for the report he would have to file. He passed Ben Carter's blighted field, his jaw tight. Then he came to Arthur Vance's section. He stopped the truck in the middle of the road. He got out and walked to the edge of the road ditch, his polished boots now covered in a film of dust. He stared. He saw what Ben had seen, the dying wall of sunflowers, serving as a buffer, the perfect field of wheat behind it. He walked into the ditch and up to the edge of the sunflowers. He pulled one of the infested stalks. It was heavy with bugs. He looked past it into the wheat. He saw no bugs. He saw ladybugs, lacewings, beneficial insects. He saw a healthy, balanced environment. His entire professional training, his company's entire philosophy, was based on the idea of chemical intervention. The problem was a pest. The solution was a poison. It was a simple, profitable equation. What he was looking at was a different kind of math entirely. It was a math that involved biology, observation, and patience. It was a math he had not been taught. He stood there for nearly half an hour, motionless, as the hot Kansas wind blew around him. The certainty he had brought with him to Harlan County had evaporated, leaving him with a profound and unsettling silence. The harvest came in late August. The heat finally broke, and the combines began to roll across the county. The mood was somber. The yields were down, in some cases catastrophically. The grain that was harvested was often of low quality, shrunken and light, leading to heavy penalties at the elevator. The chinch bugs and the drought had taken a heavy toll. Arthur Vance harvested his field with his 1965 John Deere 95 combine. It was a small machine by modern standards, with only a 16-foot header. It was slow, noisy, and lacked an air-conditioned cab. But like all of Arthur's equipment, it was perfectly maintained and did its job flawlessly. He worked alone, moving back and forth across the field in neat, overlapping rows, the golden wheat falling before the reel, the clean grain pouring into the holding tank. He hauled his grain to the same elevator as his neighbors. The elevator manager, a man named Henderson who had seen it all, leaned out of his office as Arthur's old Ford truck rumbled onto the scales. "Mornin', Arthur. How'd you fare?" "It's a fair crop," Arthur said, his usual understatement. Henderson took a sample of the wheat, running it through his testing equipment. He looked at the gauges, then looked again. He scooped a handful of the grain. It was heavy, plump, and clean. "My God, Arthur," he said, his voice filled with surprise. "Test weight is 62 pounds. Protein is over 13%. There's not a speck of damage on here. This is the best wheat I've seen all year. All decade, maybe. Arthur just nodded. He dumped his load and went back for another. He did this all day for 3 days. When he was finished, the numbers told the final, undeniable story. His yield was 67 bushels to the acre. The county average that year was 31. Ben Carter, his neighbor, had managed only 24, and his grain was so light he had to sell it at a steep discount as feed. Arthur's crop, grown without a drop of expensive insecticide, was worth more than double what his neighbors had managed to salvage with their repeated chemical applications. The success was absolute. The math did not require a pencil. A week after the harvest was over, a clean white pickup truck, the AgriCorp logo gleaming on its door, pulled slowly into Arthur Vance's driveway. It stopped near the house, and the engine cut out. The silence that followed felt heavy. Kevin Thorne got out. He was not wearing his corporate polo shirt. He was wearing a plain blue work shirt and jeans. He looked younger, less certain. Ben Carter got out of the passenger side. They walked toward the porch where Arthur was sitting, cleaning a piece of equipment. Arthur watched them approach. He did not get up. He continued his work, slowly wiping the grease from a bearing with a clean rag. He waited. Thorne stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He took off his hat and held it in his hands. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice quiet and devoid of its previous salesmanship. "I came to say, I was wrong." The admission hung in the still afternoon air. It was a simple, direct statement. There were no excuses, no corporate jargon. Ben Carter stood beside him, his gaze fixed on the ground, nodding in agreement. "And I came to ask if you'd be willing to tell me why it worked," Thorne continued. "What you did. I've never seen anything like it." Arthur Vance finished cleaning the bearing, setting it carefully on a clean piece of burlap. He looked at the two men. He saw in Thorne's face not the arrogance of a salesman, but the genuine confusion of a student who had just discovered his textbook was incomplete. He saw in Ben's face the weary humility of a man who had paid dearly for a lesson. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Water's in the pump house," he said, gesturing with his head. "Bring a dipper." He led them not into the house, but into the old machine shed. The air inside was cool and smelled of oil, soil, and time. He did not lecture them. He did not gloat. He simply began to explain. He started with the tractor, explaining why the weight of the old John Deere was better for the dry soil, how it compacted the ground less than the new, heavier machines. He showed them the simple mechanics of the two-row planter, how its design ensured a consistent seed depth that was critical for germination in a dry year. Then, he led them to the small, tidy office in his house. He gestured for them to sit, though he remained standing. He went to the bookshelf and took down the old, cloth-bound ledger from 1954. He opened it on the desk, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. He flattened the page for August, the one with his father's neat script and a hand-drawn map. "My father wrote this," Arthur said. "He was a student of the land, not of the university." He pointed to the key sentence. "Give them a better meal." He explained the principle of the trap crop. It was not about killing the pest. It was about understanding its nature and redirecting it. "The chinch bug is a creature of habit," he said, his voice low and even. "It wants the easiest, sweetest source of moisture it can find. The wheat stalks, as they mature, get woody, harder to pierce. A young sunflower stalk is soft, full of sap. It's like offering a man a glass of cold water or a muddy puddle. His choice is simple." He explained how the timing was critical. The sunflowers had to be planted so they would be at their most tender and appealing stage just as the bugs were beginning their main migration. Too early, and the sunflowers would be too mature. Too late, and they would not be established enough to serve as a barrier. "And the ladybugs," Thorne said, remembering Arthur's question at the town meeting. "Your poison kills everything," Arthur stated without malice. "It kills the bugs you want to kill, and it kills the bugs that would have helped you. When you spray, you create a clean slate. The pests are always the first to come back because they breed faster. You make the problem worse for the next year. You make yourself dependent on the poison." He tapped the notebook. "My way, the beneficials are left alone. The ladybugs and the lacewings, they come to the sunflowers to eat the chinch bug eggs. They build up their numbers. They become a second line of defense. They clean up any bugs that get through the trap. Thorne was silent for a long time. He stared at the handwritten page from 1954, then at the glossy, data-filled brochure for SiloGuard X that he had pulled from his back pocket. He was looking at two entirely different worlds, two completely opposite ways of thinking. One was a monologue of control and domination. The other was a dialogue of observation and accommodation. One was about selling a product. The other was about stewarding a system. This, Thorne said, tapping the old ledger, this is true integrated pest management. What we're doing, it's just chemical sales. He looked up at Arthur, his eyes filled with a new, sober respect. I'm going to write a new report, a real one. I'm going to propose a pilot program to the company based on this, on using trap crops. I like to call it the Vance method, if that's all right with you. A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, crossed Arthur's face. It's not my method, he said. It's my father's, and it's probably his father's before him. You can call it what you want. It's just farming. Thorne left that day a different man than the one who had arrived in Harlan County a month earlier. He did write his report. It caused a stir at AgriCorp. His superiors were not pleased with its conclusions, which implicitly criticized their entire business model. But the data from Arthur's harvest was undeniable. Thorne, with a stubbornness that surprised even himself, pushed for the pilot program. He used his photograph of Arthur's strange, flower-bordered field as the centerpiece of his presentation. The next spring, the story of Arthur's sunflowers was the main topic of conversation at the co-op. The laughter and skepticism were gone, replaced by a grudging, then genuine, respect. That year, with the memory of the previous year's losses still fresh, a dozen farmers in Harlan County planted a 10-foot border of mammoth gray-striped sunflowers around their wheat fields. It became a new, common sight on the landscape. Fields of green and gold, framed in the bright, cheerful yellow of sunflowers. It was no longer a strange or foolish act. It was simply the way things were done. It became the new normal, a piece of local wisdom regained. The old, cloth-bound notebook remained on the shelf in Arthur's office. It was more than just a book. It was a symbol. It was proof that the most advanced technology is not always the most effective. It was an anchor, a testament to the enduring value of site-specific, generational knowledge. It held the quiet truth that the land itself is the greatest teacher, and its lessons are written not in textbooks, but in the behavior of weeds and insects, in the color of the soil, in the patterns of the wind and rain. Ben Carter became a regular visitor at Arthur's farm. He did not come to talk about prices or politics. He came to learn. He spent long evenings in the small office, carefully turning the pages of the old ledgers. Arthur would sit with him, quietly explaining his father's notes on crop rotation, on green manures, on reading the signs of the weather. Ben absorbed it all, his youthful enthusiasm tempered by a newfound humility. He was learning a new language, the language of the land itself. He had stopped his contracts with AgriCorp. He was saving his own seed now. He was the successor, the one who would carry the knowledge forward, ensuring that the conversation between his family and the land would not be broken. One evening, as the two of them stood looking out over a field of young wheat, bordered by a promising row of newly sprouted sunflowers, Ben asked a question that had been on his mind for some time. "Arthur," he said, "weren't you ever worried? Weren't you afraid it wouldn't work, with everyone laughing at you?" Arthur Vance looked at the horizon, at the vast and ancient landscape that had been his only true teacher. He thought of his father, of the feel of the old tractor, of the simple, unshakable truth he had carried in his heart through all those days of doubt. "The land doesn't care if you're laughing," he said, his voice as quiet and steady as the setting sun. "It only cares if you're listening."